thank you for joining us for the Colorado Corn Administrative Committee's monthly webinar. Today we have with us Wayne Stoskopf from NCGA and Garin Vorthmann, who is with, oh my gosh, I just spaced it. Garin, Colorado Legislative Services. I've worked with Garin for so long, it just went by me. But want to thank them very much for joining us today to give us an update on state and federal policies that are going on that will have a possible impact to your operations on the Eastern Plains. And so first, I want to put a disclaimer out. The Colorado Corn Administrative Committee is the checkoff organization for Colorado Corn, and we do not use any of those funds for lobbying. This is a purely informational session so that you know what has happened in the legislative areas that may impact you and your operations. And so just a disclaimer that we are not lobbying, nor did we take any positions as an organization on any of these bills, or will we? So that's on the table. And so we'll kick things off. We're going to start with a federal update from Wayne first. Wayne serves as the lead staff for the risk management and transportation team with NCGA. He's previously worked for the Senate Agricultural Committee, where as senior professional staff, he oversaw commodity, crop insurance, disaster, and grain standard programs. He led staff level negotiations from the commodities and group insurance titles of the 2018 Farm Bill. Wayne also formerly served as a legislative assistant for Senator Pat Roberts and earlier for Rep. Lynn Jenkins, handling agricultural issues in each office. Wayne was raised on his family farm here near Hoisington, Kansas, and graduated from Kansas State University with a degree in agribusiness. So without further ado, Wayne, take it away.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Nick. And I am going to share a couple slides just to help walk through some of the tax and infrastructure proposals. Of course, I put these slides together yesterday and they are already somewhat out of date given the announcements and the news of the day, but I was going to try to share. It says I'm not able to share my screen. So Nick, you might have to do that. Thankfully, the news of the day is on the infrastructure side.
There you go, Wayne.
Awesome. Not on the tax side, so we will kick off there. All right, so once again, Wayne Stoskopf for the National Corn Growers Association, originally from not too far away, central Kansas, but I do live in Washington, D.C. and work most of my days with Congress on kind of the federal issues. So to set the stage, the kind of two proposals from the Biden administration, once he was in the administration, have been the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. These were rolled out as part of the Build Back Better agenda and are the major proposals from the administration post looking at the COVID packages. There were tax proposals released with both of those pieces, and I'll work on the tax piece first, and then we can talk about some of the spending side. On the American Jobs Plan, it was mostly focused on corporate tax rates, raising the corporate tax rates to 25 or 28% from the current 21%, enacting a global minimum corporate tax rate, really to focus on some of the technology businesses that are really in the United States but operate multinationally, and then some repeals of fossil fuel credits. There are other components that were also released, but those are some of the major ones that certainly could impact agriculture and rural America. The ones that caught more of a folks' attention, and rightfully so, are on the individual rates side that are captured under the American Families Plan. The biggest revenue raiser is raising tax rates on capital gains. That's both a policy priority for a lot of members of the Democratic Party, but it also raises a lot of money. And in order for that to show a net gain in terms of revenue for the federal government, they've also looked at eliminating the stepped up basis for capital gains over $1 million. They've offered protections for family owned and operated businesses and farms, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But that proposal certainly is all tied into the capital gains rate increase. as well as some other provisions like increasing the IRS budget to capture taxes that are owed and raise additional revenue that way, as well as limiting like-kind exchanges that some folks in agriculture use, but certainly real estate, timber, other industries rely heavily on the like-kind exchange provisions. Again, these are proposals from the administration. They did not roll them out as legislative text, so it will take an act of Congress for really any of these pieces to move forward. Honing in on the stepped-up basis capital gains provisions, all we have is really that first bullet on what an exemption would look like for farms and small businesses. Really, the intent is that it shouldn't impact folks who continue to own and operate the business, but that sentence leaves a lot of questions unanswered. What makes up a family? Is it just the lineal parents to children, grandparents to the next generation as well? Or can cousins be included, aunts and uncles, second cousins? So it's that we know that our definition of family in terms of an ag community is often different than USDA or the IRS. The same goes for business and tax structures. If you're formulated as a pass-through entity, is there a difference from being a corporation or an LLC? And we have not gotten answers on those yet. Also have an unknown listed as cash rent and land leasing. Sometimes the IRS will treat that land then as an investment property instead of part of an operating farm. So that could potentially trigger this new transfer tax and kind of void the exemption, which we know cash renting and land leasing is very common. And a lot of producers, the land is really your retirement. So that those types of questions are really important. And finally, IRS enforcement of these provisions. We know that in the past, when there have been changes proposed on stepped-up basis, that the IRS may, if you don't have the good records 40, 50 years ago on a piece of land your parents bought, establishing the original basis will be difficult. And too often the IRS has said that they'll just put that at zero and you'd be owe the entire kind of gain on that basis, which would be quite dramatic. And really, the IRS is not the Department of Agriculture. They are not a farmer-friendly federal government entity. They do a lot of great work, don't get me wrong, but they are not built to be the advocate for agriculture, which is the Department of Agriculture. So far, this provision has gained a lot of attention on Capitol Hill. We saw letters this spring from over 100 Republicans on the House side and additional folks on the Senate side opposed to repeal at all. 13 House Democrats wrote a letter saying they support a strong ag exemption and want to make sure that that is included in the efforts going forward. And then in response to a call that Chairman David Scott from Georgia had with the National Corn Board, he wrote a letter relaying major concerns with the entire proposal, including the ag exemption. And those letters went to either House or Senate leadership and the president himself. So there is not necessarily, it's hard to see a path going forward with this level of opposition in a bipartisan package. And even if it's a reconciliation package for the process where it could move on party line votes, there are enough members that are raising concerns across the aisle that this will be something that leadership will have to consider and work through. So unknown on the process, but let alone a lot of unknowns on the policy considerations at this point. So you might ask, what is the National Corn Growers Association doing about it? And as Nick said, I work with the Risk Management and Transportation Action Team, which is the vestibule for a lot of the policy conversations. Earlier this year, the federal policies on tax were updated at Corn Congress to show our support for the current tax code after the previous tax bill passed in 2017. We needed to update our policies a little bit to be reflective of the situation on the ground. We've done educational events with tax consultants like Keiko Isom. And then in DC, we work with a broad ag tax coalition. I think over 40 groups from the farm bureaus of the world, cattlemen, to commodity groups, sent a letter saying our priorities are to protect the current tax code with the estate tax, high exemption, the current treatment of stepped up basis, and provisions like kind exchanges. We like what we have, please do not change it. And that letter went to House and Senate leadership. We're also part of the Family Business Estate Tax Coalition that focuses on the estate tax and stepped up basis under capital gains. There was a report released in April demonstrating the value of the current protections in the tax code, and that changing stepped up basis, fully eliminating it, would have a large impact on not only farms and small businesses, but on GDP and employment as well. The Risk Management and Transportation Action Team, made up of 13 growers from across the Corn Belt, also approved a project examining the current protections in current law for agriculture in the tax code, and then what the proposed family farm exemption to stepped up basis would look like. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of details there, so it's not a full-blown economic analysis showing just how bad a proposal might be in terms of individual farm operations. But the report was released this week and outlines the policy parameters for these proposals, as well as some case studies of what it could look like. And the tax consultants also flagged that this could have a really dramatic increase in the tax burden for a lot of family farm operations, particularly those that don't fit in that neat generational change of just going from parents to children to grandchildren. But even in that situation, there may be folks who are impacted with the information that we have to date. We will continue to lobby on behalf of these provisions, and if packages moving together, that we need to kind of try to broaden an exemption, we can have those conversations. But right now, we're really focused on demonstrating the impact of the provisions and our support for the current law. Now, typically we start with the shiny objects first and then go to the worries on the tax code and how you pay for it. But today, the shiny object is the bipartisan Senate infrastructure deal with the White House on the spending side, particularly for hard infrastructure. These numbers were based off of the Senate deal that was released last week among about 21 senators. So some of these numbers will look different from what the administration agreed to overnight and rolled out this morning. But they're in the ballpark, and this will help kind of demonstrate where folks are going. President Biden wanted around $1 trillion in additional spending on infrastructure for kind of hard roads, bridges, broadband waterways. He also supported electric vehicles, infrastructure. Those are all included in this kind of package. The majority of spending are on things like roads and bridges, highways, airports, but broadband is included. Inland waterways are certainly important to the movement of commodities across the country. And the electric vehicles portion is dramatically scaled down from over 100 billion in the president's American Jobs Plan. But that's something that a bipartisan agreement, there's still certainly funding for some of those infrastructure pieces. The pay for side has been one that has kept this deal from coalescing for quite a while. Republicans did not want to touch any of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 and did not want to raise taxes. Democrats were wary of using COVID relief funds as a source, since they were kind of earmarked for states and local governments and other kind of uses that may not have been spent to this point. And the big one that caught a lot of attention was the indexing the gas tax to inflation. It was included in this list as potential pay-fors as a placeholder. It sounds like it's dropped out. The White House does not want to raise taxes on anyone making under $400,000 a year, and they felt user fees were going to be a tax on the middle class. Even if it's indexing the current gas tax to inflation, they thought that violated his principles in his campaign. There was a lot of conversations about including electric vehicles in an alternative alternative vehicle per mile type of tax. And that seems to have also been left out of the pay-fors. But the good news is it looks like there would not be a tax increase attached to this bipartisan bill that we can talk about there, whether or not it'll be able to move forward. But they are rolling that out today with the White House agreement. So there is renewed hope that there will be an infrastructure bill this summer around $1 trillion and really focus on traditional hard infrastructure. To give a little bit of a backdrop of how a deal came together, there were over 20 senators. They called themselves the G20, split evenly between the two parties. The main negotiators were Rob Portman and Kristen Sinema, so Ohio and Arizona. Joe Manchin is a kind of swing vote in all of this, saying that he really wanted conversations to happen in a bipartisan manner. And certainly close to home for you all is John Hickenlooper was part of this broader group of 20 that has already put their names behind the deal. The question right now is, can these 20 senators deliver 60 votes to move a bill through kind of regular order in the United States Senate? Or will the conversations around breaking the filibuster and moving that threshold down to 50 kind of win over? As the legislative process continues, we'll see pressure on both sides. We saw last week several progressive Democrats say that they would not support a package like this unless Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, and others agreed to a larger package on kind of the family infrastructure kind of piece, college education, pre-K education, healthcare pieces. They have not made that kind of commitment publicly. So it's unknown if Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and others will support the bill. And the fewer Democrats that support the bill means the more Republicans will have to support it. So they're at least starting at a good place with 20 members, but it will take more than them to pass this deal as legislation. And so far, Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell have been a little bit hands-off and have not weighed in too heavily with their caucus. So that they'll be doing the vote counting and seeing if they can get this group to move the bill. I had how long will negotiations continue? Sounds like they cut a deal last night and are ready to move forward with this package. They'll have to release some additional details and fine tune it. You can also take this to mean if it's a reconciliation bill, it seemed as inevitable for up to 4 to 6 trillion in spending outside of roads, bridges, highways, traditional infrastructure. Will that start in a bipartisan space, or will it just be one party? And if it's only one party, what all can be included, would be included in that type of package with Democratic votes only? So far, Senator Manchin and Sinema have continued to say that they want things to move through a regular order, and they are worried about the overall cost size of those packages and the pay-fors as well. So aspirational is Bernie Sanders saying it'll be $6 trillion worth in additional spending. It will likely pare down to some point, but every member of the caucus will have ideas of ways to spend money and will want to do it now. So we'll be watching the reconciliation bill. Reconciliation is also what will likely be paid for with individual tax rate changes. So that also is something to watch as that process continues. There certainly will be some folks who say, we just did the infrastructure bill, let's not spend additional money at all. So it will be interesting to watch how the two kind of vehicles move or don't move over the summer and early fall. We don't know quite yet. A bill this size with this much of impact on the economy will take time not only to write, but it will take time to negotiate and pass as well. And with 50-50 US Senate and a very thin margin in the House, it will take a lot of vote counting as well and finessing. So it will take a while. It's not something that will be voted on in the next 2 to 3 weeks. The Senate is going to be out for starting today for 2 weeks, and the House will be in recess for the 4th of July kind of period as well in about 2 weeks. So July and August will be kind of critical months. Now, finally, kind of a federal update on some of the USDA programs. Know that drought has been a concern not only this year, but last year. And there have been recent announcements about WIP Plus disaster assistance, as well as quality loss assistance. So I wanted to mention that those are programs that are considered ad hoc programs. They're not built into the Farm Bill. They have been created for kind of certain purposes, and Congress is still debating whether or not to extend those for 2020 or for 2021. And that will be something we continue to engage in as well, both the RMTAT team and NCGA. And then finally, the Pandemic Assistance for Producers Initiative is the Biden's spin on their team, and certainly Secretary Vilsack, on all things COVID from USDA. They have released the additional funds for CFAP that came out this spring. That was the additional $20 per acre payments. The Pandemic Cover Crop Program was released June 1st with a tight turnaround of June 15th to report any cover crop acres you planted last fall for the ahead of this crop. And that was a $5 per acre benefit on crop insurance premiums. And then recently they've announced that there'll be additional assistance for biofuel producers. This all fits under the kind of pandemic assistance components. So we expect there to be additional rollouts of the COVID relief as they write the rules for both the pandemic cover crop program and biofuels, and additional aid for livestock growers and others that were considered left out of the CFAP 1 and 2 programs. And USDA is going to release those details, further details probably this July or August in a rulemaking process. So we'll have more news there as we go. All right, I will stop for questions on either USDA disaster programs or tax programs, and I will stop the slideshow on my end.
All right, well, thank you so much, Wayne, for that update. You know, I saw that there was about 16 billion in there for waterways, and while we don't have a whole lot of waterways here in Colorado, those are vitally important for making sure that we can get our agricultural commodities from where they're produced to the global marketplaces, and that's one of our strongest competitive advantages. So, you know, it's great to see that they're putting some significant spending dollars towards that infrastructure. You did mention that EVs were getting about $15 billion in the realm of biofuels, such as biodiesel and ethanol. Since we're talking to corn producers today, is there any subsidies or anything that's going towards the use of ethanol, higher blends of ethanol to support those biofuel industries in this transportation bill?
Yeah, and those are the types of questions that in the broad rollout, we've got kind of some bullet points, and I think the White House today released a few paragraphs about some of these provisions, and members of Congress from across the Corn Belt are interested in including similar types of incentives for ethanol use, whether flex fuel vehicles or biofuel infrastructure components. So there's a lot of marker bills kind of being floated around, and if you have 2 or 3 senators or 4 or 5 members of the House that are interested in those types of things, they can work to get them included. So that's where we're positioning to try to make sure that there are pieces for the biofuels industry that will benefit corn growers included as well. But I have not seen specifics to that level quite yet. And as the legislative process continues, there'll be a lot of those types of details to sort out.
Great. Thanks for that. We do have one question for you from Marilyn Drake. She is the executive director of the Colorado Vegetable Growers Association, so our Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association. She is asking, is water storage in the West most likely to be part of the infrastructure package? We all know water is quite important out here, and storing it when we have it to have it when we need it is very important. So did you see anything regarding that before we move on to our state update?
I have not, but I will admit that when I'm thinking of in some of NCGA's priorities, certainly the waterways, inland waterways systems has been kind of the focus and something that is released in a broad text as kind of waterways. So given the really historic drought the last 2 years and previous wildfires across the West, I think there has been attention to those types of issues, and I would not be surprised if there are components of infrastructure that would include water storage as well as attempts to work with not only Forest Service but others on wildfires as well. So I think water storage would have a component at some point, whether that's through Interior or USDA or the Army Corps, I'm not sure. But those are good questions, and certainly your delegation would be on top and watching those types of issues really closely as well.
All right, well, thank you for that, Wayne. So at this point, we're going to move on from the federal level, come on down to a more local level and talk about what happened in the last session of the Colorado State Legislature. So for that, we have Garin Vorthmann of Colorado Legislative Strategies with us. Garin began her political career in Washington, D.C., and worked for Senator Wayne Allard, which many of you may remember. And he ran the Government Affairs Department for the Colorado Farm Bureau before joining Colorado Legislative Services in 2007. She became a partner in 2012 and has steadfastly through her career, Garin has honed her public policy knowledge on all issues related to agriculture, especially in water and property rights. And so without further ado, Garin, take it away and give us an update of the 2021 legislative session and some of the important takeaways for agriculture.
Thanks, Nick. Happy to be with you guys today, and happy summer. The 2021 legislative session officially wrapped up on June 8th. We have kind of had an ongoing session since the spring of 2020, when we were in the middle of our regular session and COVID hit. We took a break, came back in May, and worked into June. Then they had a special session at the end of the year in November, and then we started back up again in January, where they worked for just 3 or 4 days and then took another break due to COVID, and officially came back in February to resume their work. So it's been kind of a topsy-turvy and round robin of legislative work over the last year and a half. But like I said, we did wrap up on June 8th. There were a total of 623 bills introduced in 2021, with the Democrats having full control of the House and Senate and the governor's office. There's not much that impeded their very progressive agenda this year. And we saw things from health bills to try to address cost of healthcare, increased transportation funding, quite a few environmentally related bills introduced that were, quite frankly, very progressive and will have far-reaching implications on the state for years to come. On the ag front, there was a number of very high-profile bills. The one that probably took up the most of our time and our efforts was Senate Bill 87, the Agricultural Worker Rights Bill. This is a bill that was sponsored by Senator Jesse Danielson and Dominic Moreno in the Senate, and did a number of things. Upon introduction, the bill allowed for agricultural employees to organize in labor unions, increased the minimum wage, took away agriculture has been historically exempt from minimum wage and overtime rules across the country. And this bill removed that exemption on the state level here in Colorado. The bill originally created an overtime threshold of 40 hours per week and 12 hours per day, established meal and rest breaks, transportation and housing requirements that employers would be required to provide their employees, prohibited the use of the short-handled hoe and long-handled hoes, opened up opportunities for lawsuits against employers from whistleblowers, and allows access by key service providers to visit the employees anywhere on the employer's property or at the employer-provided housing. And then finally, it created an agricultural work advisory committee that would be housed at the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment to study and analyze wages and working conditions in the agricultural sector. This bill was introduced the first day back in February. The bill sponsors did not reach out and have conversations with the ag industry about the details of this bill. We found out about it literally the end of the week prior to it being introduced, and we're quite surprised when it was introduced so quickly coming back in February. So we had to scramble and work on amendments instead of being able to help craft the language before introduction. And there were significant changes made to the bill. In the Senate, most of the devastating language that was regarding whistleblowers and a term that is fairly new to ag labor or to labor standards in general is a relator, and that's a third party representative that could file a lawsuit or a claim against an employer on behalf of an employee. They didn't have to have an official relationship or any direct connection with the employee, and they could file on behalf of the state and then take the farmer to court and get the settlement. That is a significantly different kind of concept in labor law. And we worked with the business community and other industries to get that language removed from the bill in the Senate Business Committee. So that was one of the first key wins that we got in an amendment. We also were able in the Senate to move a lot of the language to rulemaking instead of having it be set in statute. And these things that were moved into rulemaking are the meal and rest break provisions. The Department of Labor will be the one to determine the parameters about what kind of breaks that an employer is required to give. Also heat stress protections. And so when it's really hot outside, the bill directs the Department of Labor to promulgate rules on how to train the employees to avoid heat stress, providing water and shade and those kind of things. And then most importantly, the overtime language was moved into rulemaking. As I said at the beginning, the bill originally would have had a 40-hour week, 12-hour-a-day threshold when overtime would be in place. The amendment removed those specifics and now just directs the Department of Labor to promulgate rules for how overtime will be implemented in the ag industry. Moving on into the House, we continue to try to work on some of the top priority areas in the bill. We were able, the whistleblower protection language that's in the bill originally would have allowed or would have required the employee or a whistleblower to go straight to district court if they felt that they had been retaliated against by an employer. We were successful in getting language added that allows for them to go through the administrative process at the Department of Labor before going to court if they choose. And that was key because we felt like that was better protection for the employees, because you don't have to have a lawyer to go to the Department of Labor and file a complaint against an employer. But if you go to district court, you really do need to have a lawyer. So that was one key amendment we got in the House. We also were able to lower the proposed minimum wage for range workers that's in the bill, provided process by where the Department of Ag can do a case-by-case variance on the exemption to the hand weeding restrictions. And this is very important to our fruit and vegetable growers here in Colorado. And they'll be able to work with the Department of Ag on site-specific variances to those restrictions. And then finally, the bill was amended to exempt livestock haulers and combine or harvest operators from the meal and rest break requirements. So moving forward, like I said, a lot of this stuff was sent to the Department of Labor for rulemaking. We don't have the exact specifics on what that's going to look like yet, but In communications with the department, they've let us know that they are likely to start the stakeholder meeting process in August. And then once the proposed rules are formally noticed, that's likely to happen sometime in September, and they have to have them finalized by the end of October. And then likely to be implemented and put into effect starting in January. So that's as much as we know at this point on what the rulemaking will encompass. The ag industry worked lockstep with each other throughout this entire process, and we're already moving that working together into the rulemaking side of this. In good news on this front, yesterday the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling on a case that came out of California with regards to access to employees on private property by labor unions. And the Supreme Court ruled that that kind of access would be a form of a takings, since it is private property, unless the property owner was compensated for that access. The reason that's going to have an important role to play in Colorado is Senate Bill 87 did provide or mandate access. It says that the employer cannot restrict access by key service providers to the employees at the employer provided housing, which is typically on private property. So we're trying to figure out how that ruling impacts that part. And then the Department of Labor has also been directed to promulgate rules on access by key service providers to the employees during working hours. And this is a direct connection to that Supreme Court case. And we're trying, like I said, we're trying to figure out just exactly how that court case is going to affect Colorado, especially as we move into this rulemaking phase of this bill. But we had lots of other things that we worked on, not just ag labor, although at times it really felt like that was literally all that we were working on. The Department of Ag got 2 new programs added. House Bill 1181 created the Agricultural Soil Health Program, which is a voluntary soil health program at the Department of Ag, and authorizes the department to provide grants and loans, and establishes a monitoring system that analyzes environmental and economic benefits of soil health practices. And it also establishes a soil health testing program. It is a voluntary program for producers to participate in, and it creates a 9-member soil health advisory committee. And that committee is made up of representatives from the Conservation District Board, agricultural producers, both irrigated farmers, dryland farmers, livestock producers, organic producers. The committee is extensive, and we tried to make sure that as many different interests and stakeholders were involved in this new advisory committee. Closely related to that was House Bill 1242, which creates the Agricultural Drought and Climate Resilience Office at the Department of Ag. This is the purpose of this office will be to advise the Commissioner of Agriculture and the Colorado Agricultural Value Added Development Board, as well as other state agencies, on the impacts to agriculture of drought and climate policies and programs, and then to help find resources to provide farmers and ranchers support to help them be more resilient in times of drought. Wolf funding was also a very big conversation at the Capitol this year. If you remember, Initiative 114 was passed by the voters in 2020. And what that initiative did was allows for the reintroduction of wolves into certain areas of Colorado. The initiative did not have any specifics about what kind of funding needed to be used to help pay for the reintroduction, as well as how to pay for the losses to livestock from the depredation by the wolves. And so there were a number of bills that were introduced to try to provide some funding for that. Senate Bill 105 was the first one, and that would have outlined a public hearing process for the Parks and Wildlife Commission to follow to get public feedback on how and when to reintroduce the wolves. That bill unfortunately died in the Senate Ag Committee early in the session. But House Bill 1243 was a successful measure that provides funding from both the general fund and a number of other wildlife funds to fund this wolf program and give livestock producers a reliable source of funding to pay for the consequences of having wolves being introduced into Colorado. And then in the state budget, Representative Jenny Arndt and Representative Perry Will were successful in putting an amendment to the state budget that provides a little over $1 million from the general fund to implement the wolf reintroduction program. Conservation easements. In Colorado, we have had a very controversial and volatile conservation easement program in place for a number of years. And we have had many bills over the last couple of years that were aimed at trying to fix the problems that have arisen with this conservation easement program. This year, there were two key bills that were introduced. Senate Bill 33, and this was a proposal that came from a conservation easement working group that had been established through legislation a couple of years ago. And it was introduced to address the problems around disallowed conservation easement tax credits. And what happened there in a number of years ago, there were quite a few easements that were put into place, but then the IRS came in and said that the valuation that those easements, the land valuation that those easements were based on was not correct. And therefore the farmer had to pay back the tax credit that they had been granted from the state. And this was obviously created significant burdens for a large number of landowners who had their easement disallowed. So what this bill would have done is made changes to the conservation easement tax credit program to create new transferable tax credit for previously disallowed tax credits. And then it created an ombudsman and arbitration process to resolve any remaining disputes concerning the distribution of the credit. The bill made it through the Senate, but was killed in the last week of the session by the House Appropriations Committee. Closely connected with Senate Bill 33 was House Bill 1233. And this is a bill that looks forward into the conservation easement program, whereas Senate Bill 33 was a bill that looked backwards. This bill was introduced to provide updates to the current conservation easement program by making modifications to the conservation easement tax credit program by increasing the credit amounts, changing how transferred credits are tracked and verified, and then broadening the entities that can donate or accept donations of easements. This bill was successful and is expected to be signed by the governor here in a week. Finally, with all of the different, the session was really marked by a lot of budget issues, and largely due to last year's Joint Budget Committee efforts to cut the budget in the face of the ongoing COVID pandemic. We didn't know exactly how it was going to impact the state, and the Joint Budget Committee and the legislature cut more than $3 billion out of our state budget last year. But after a year of better than expected tax revenues coming into the state, and the state bouncing back, at least in certain segments of the economy, bouncing back a little bit quicker from the COVID shutdown, Colorado had about $800 million left over to pump back into the state's economy, and they created a Colorado state level stimulus program to distribute this $800 million. Of that $800 million, $76 million of that goes directly to agriculture and ag programs. Money is being sent to provide funding to implement the state water plan. Money is being allocated to provide support for agricultural events like the state fair and county fairs and the stock show. There's money that was allocated for Colorado Proud program that's run through the Department of Ag. Money for the agricultural and drought resiliency program that I mentioned a little while ago, as well as the soil health program. And then one of the biggest areas of money from that's specific for agriculture was Senate Bill 248, which creates a revolving loan program at the Department of Ag for agriculture. And there's two different pieces to that program. One is the infrastructure side. It's the farm to market loans and grant program. And I think $5 to $10 million will be allocated to that farm to market program to help farmers be able to get their products to the marketplace. And then the other side of the bill for $10 to $20 million is a loan program for Colorado's farmers and ranchers. The money, they will work with a financial institution, a bank, to distribute those loans. But the idea for that is that it's going to be a revolving fund that can go into perpetuity and have a place where if you need a small loan and you're having a hard time getting it through traditional avenues, you might be able to work with the Department of Ag and a bank to get this, to get one of the loans. And then additionally, that is important to Colorado, but not just for ag. There were a couple different bills that provided stimulus money for rural economic development and the Rural Jumpstart Zone Grant Program. So while there was a lot of things that happened in this session that were very, very difficult and made significant changes to how agriculture can operate in Colorado, there was also some really good things that happened, and the state did provide some significant investment into the industry through their ability to have that $800 million stimulus. So with that, that's pretty much all I was going to touch on. I know there was a lot of other issues that were discussed at the Capitol that you might have questions on. So, feel free to ask me questions on the bills that I did talk about, or any that you've heard about that I might not have mentioned.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that update, Garin. That was very informative, and I can only imagine how much actually happened at this session. And it's good to hear that while there was some things that may have been not so great for ag, but there's also some silver linings to this and some of the programs that were started. One of those that you mentioned was the soil health. I believe on top of that was the some funding for the Acre 3 program, some ag efficiency, or some funding for renewables and efficiencies for energy on ag operations. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit? We've got a few people online that might be able to take a part in those programs because I think they have $3 million and they got to spend it in a year.
Yeah, and we're waiting to see what the Department of Ag, the information that they release on that, but you're correct. Through the Climate Resiliency Office, they are going to be allocating additional funds to that Acre 3 program, and it's a program that helps farmers and ranchers put energy efficiency measures on their in their operation, and the funding is tied to the state severance tax, and it's in the lowest bucket, lowest level of priorities for funding. And so when severance tax, as it ebbs and flows and comes in different amounts throughout the number of years, then what happens is this is one of the programs that is the last to get funded if there's any extra severance tax money. And so they're trying to boost that by replacing or putting that money back into that program so it can be a viable option for Colorado's farmers and ranchers.
That's great. That's great. So one thing that I did want to kind of pick your brain on, Garin, is I think some of us have seen the latest Wall Street Journal article where there was a law passed in 2019, and now remote workers in Colorado may not have the opportunity for some jobs that are across the nation. Do you see any other bills that were passed, maybe not directed at ag, that may have ramifications in future years, maybe on a business side, health insurance side, employment side, that maybe not have been specifically directed at ag, but would rear their heads in a couple of years when it goes into effect?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Nick. And I do see that there's going to be significant employment law conversations in the next couple of years. We've already had in the last 3 years significant changes made in our employment law with the creation of the Paid Family Medical Leave Act, also whistleblower protections in times of COVID. Those were 2 bills, and one was an initiative and one was a bill that were passed in 2019 and 2020. The bill that you just referenced that is creating some headaches for remote workers in Colorado is the Equal Pay Act. And what that was intended to do was to remove the discrepancy between men and women and minority groups that have different levels of pay for the same job. But what it also did is it requires employers to post the job salary, and they have to share it with everybody in the company, regardless of qualifications. And it's creating a lot of issues for employers who might have some employees in Colorado, but they're based in other states, because it's unclear how they have to provide that information to employees that are not located in Colorado. And so what employers have done is they've just said, we're not going to hire people in Colorado. And that was what that Wall Street Journal article referenced. Moving forward, I think there's going to be a workplace discrimination bill again. There was one this year that passed through the Senate that ended up dying in the House the last week of the session, and it increased protections against workplace discrimination, but it did it in ways that completely ignores the current process and current protections already in place to avoid discrimination. So I do anticipate that one's going to come back. And then something that the ag industry is really going to need to pay attention to is changes to independent contractor labor law. And we're seeing things in other states. California is the prime example, where they have significantly changed how an independent contractor can be classified and what kind of worker can be classified as an independent contractor. And I think that Colorado is going to have a very similar conversation here in the next, I anticipate it'll happen in the next session.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Garin, and thank you so much, Wayne. We are coming up on the top of the hour. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but thank you so much, Wayne, and thank you so much, Garin, for joining us here. Thank you for our members that came on and took an hour or so out of their day to learn a little bit about what's going on at the federal level and what happened this last session at the state level. A lot of this information we'll be posting on our website. You'll see a lot of things come out of NCGA that we'll make sure is on our website and in our e-newsletter called The Kernels. And we'll make sure that some of these updates from Garin that happened during this legislative session are on our website, so that our producers are aware of anything that could possibly impact their operations. So again, thank you for both joining us, and thank you to everyone for giving us a little bit of time of your day. And hopefully everybody has a wonderful and prosperous summer. Pray for rain.